To J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance said that people need to be more than willing to stay in unhappy marriages. Even violent marriages should continue, is the verbatim quote. Remember the train derailment in East Palatine, Ohio? That, where that train derailed and then they burned off the chemicals. I think it was polyvinyl chloride, and they burned the stuff, and all these toxic fumes went into the air and everything. And J.D. Vance worked with, I believe it was Tammy Baldwin. I could be wrong. But he worked with a Democrat because he's the senator from Ohio, to put together some legislation to tighten up the regulations on the railroads, which just sounded great, right? Until it came time for that legislation to come out of committee, and then we discovered that he had taken a bunch of money from the railroad industry and had put a poison pill into the legislation that it didn't even take effect for multiple years down the road and had been watered down, and whoever the Democrat was he was working with just started backing away from it. And that's J.D. Vance, all right? A for-sale politician. Maybe not as bad as Bob Menendez, but pretty friggin' bad. He also said, with Donald Trump's criteria, his three criteria for getting somebody as, or one of his three criteria for having a vice presidential candidate is that you have to lie about the 2020 election and agree that Trump actually won an election that he lost by over 7 million votes. And J.D. Vance has not only said that, but that was one of the three. Another one of the three was that you had to say that you wouldn't do what Mike Pence did, which is honor the Constitution, that you would actually, if you were vice president, you would overturn an election. And J.D. Vance came right out and said, yes, I would do that. I would have said, if I was in charge, I would have said that the phony electoral votes needed to be taken as seriously as the legitimate ones, which is just bonkers, right? He attacked universal child care as class warfare. Well, who's a class warfare against? Well, the ultra-rich. J.D. Vance is now a member of the ultra-rich. He's a Yale-educated lawyer. He was a hedge fund guy, made a pile of money, a crap load of money, and is the protege of one of Silicon Valley's more notorious right-wing billionaires, who at one point even went so far as to say women shouldn't vote, or things were better, I guess, when women were not voting. As I mentioned earlier, he's attacked the childless left, in quotes. His voting record with the AFL-CIO, 0. Now, there was an article in the New York Times yesterday that was talking about him, and they said, he's an advocate of labor. No, I'm sorry, his voting record, ignore what he says, his voting record with the AFL-CIO is a 0%. 0. Dean Obeidallah, his Substack newsletter, which I recommend you subscribe to, it's free. It's Dean's Report. He says, Vance has called for the criminal prosecution of a journalist and his wife. This blew my mind. I was unaware of this. And then when I read this in Dean's newsletter, it reminded me that this was like a couple of years ago, and I was, I guess, aware of it. I just completely forgotten that this was in December. Actually, not a couple of years ago. It was just last year. He wrote a letter to the Department of Justice demanding a criminal investigation into Robert Kagan. Robert Kagan is a reporter and an op-ed writer, like me. And Robert Kagan wrote an op-ed in which he said that if Donald Trump is elected, the United States faces the possibility of becoming a dictatorship. And J.D. Vance quoted that and said, will the Justice Department open an investigation into Robert Kagan for possible violations of 18 U.S.C. 241 or any other federal criminal statute? In other words, he wants the Justice Department to go after journalists and editorial writers who suggest that Donald Trump might be a dictator. Donald Trump, who himself said, I want to be a dictator on day one. He also supports Trump's pledge to use the Department of Justice to punish his political enemies. He has not only lied that Joe Biden has weaponized the DOJ to target Trump, but 2-3 weeks ago, he endorsed Trump's vow to appoint a special prosecutor to go after people in the Biden administration. For what? For running the country well, I guess. It's a crime if you're a Democrat. This is bizarre stuff. On reproductive rights for women, he has called abortion murder. He rejects exceptions for rape. He says, I don't think two wrongs make a right. This guy's over the top. I mean, I don't have any other way to describe it. And he says, I would have told the states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, and so many others that we need to have multiple slates of electors. Right. There's no such provision in the Constitution. So I will say it, and maybe he'll ask the Department of Justice to investigate me, but J.D. Vance's rhetoric makes me think that if he is vice president, that we may become a dictatorship. What else can you say?